Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine Paris in the early 1920s. The war was over, the air was heavy with the perfume of new beginnings, and the streets hummed with a hunger for life. Every café, every jazz bar, every cramped artist's room in Montmartre seemed to whisper the same word: freedom. Freedom to love, to dream, to forget. But freedom, as it so often does, came with a shadow. And in that shadow, a new obsession began to bloom, quiet, silken, deadly. It began, not in the grand salons or the opulent theaters, but in the small, smoke-filled rooms of artists and poets. They called it Le Paradis Blanc, the White Paradise. Heroin. A drug born from science, dressed in the language of medicine, but soon to become the silent heartbeat of a restless generation. Among those who wandered this glittering, uncertain world was a young woman named Élodie Marchand. She lived in a tiny attic room above Montmartre, the kind of place where the walls seemed to sigh with every brushstroke of her paintbrush. Her window faced the city rooftops, and from there she watched the lights flicker like distant stars, dreaming of a day when her art might hang in a gallery, her name whispered among the greats. By day, she painted portraits of strangers for a few francs. By night, she painted her dreams, faceless lovers, stormy skies, and the ache of something unnamed. She was 21, fragile yet fierce, with charcoal-stained fingers and a hunger that the world could not seem to feed. The city around her was alive, cabarets pulsing with jazz, poets declaiming verses to half-drunk audiences, and fashion shifting like the wind. Women cut their hair short, their dresses shorter. Men smoked and spoke of revolution. Everything was changing, and Élodie wanted to change with it. One evening, as rain pattered gently on the cobblestones, she found herself inside a small bar called Le Serpent d'Or. The walls were lined with mirrors stained by decades of cigarette smoke, and a pianist played a slow, melancholy tune that seemed to breathe through the haze. That was where she met Lucien Artois. He was a poet, or at least he said he was, with ink-stained cuffs and the kind of voice that made you forget your own name. His eyes held both brilliance and ruin, like a candle burning too fast. He spoke of beauty as though it were something one could touch, and of sorrow as though it were a friend. Lucien was the kind of man people called troubled, though they said it with a certain admiration. He had survived the war, barely, and carried in him the restlessness of someone who had seen too much of both death and desire. When he smiled at Élodie, she felt something inside her flicker awake. They talked until the music faded. He told her of his poems, she of her paintings. And when he spoke of inspiration, he mentioned something new, something he called the muse's gift. Élodie frowned. What is that? Lucien leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. It's what every artist dreams of, he said. The moment when the world slows down, when colors sing, when pain becomes poetry. It's called diacetylmorphine. But we call it heroin. The word sounded almost beautiful. Heroin. Soft, elegant, dangerous. Lucien explained that it was used by doctors for pain, that it wasn't like the opium of their father's time. It was new, clean, modern. And among artists, it had begun to spread like wildfire. They said it sharpened the senses, made music sound divine, and turned grief into creation. Élodie listened, both curious and uneasy. But when Lucien smiled at her, with that same glint of rebellion that everyone in Paris seemed to chase, she found herself nodding. That night, in the flickering light of a single candle, she let him guide her into that world. The powder shimmered faintly, white as snow. It seemed harmless, like a dream. The first taste was not pain, but warmth, soft, endless warmth, like falling into the arms of something that had been waiting for her. The noise of the city faded. The ache in her chest melted away. For the first time, she felt at peace. The next morning, she painted like a woman possessed. Her brush danced, her heart soared, her hands moved faster than her mind. The canvas came alive with colors she had never seen before, crimson like memory, blue like sorrow, gold like forgiveness. It was her best work yet. Lucien watched from the corner, a half-smile on his lips. Now you understand, he said. Now you've met the muse. Days turned into weeks. Her art flourished. She sold 3 paintings in 1 month, more than she ever had before. People began to talk about the girl from Montmartre with the haunted eyes and the paintings that seemed to breathe. But behind the beauty, something darker was growing. Her hands trembled when she didn't have the powder. Her laughter grew thinner, her eyes duller. She told herself it was fine, that it was worth it. All artists suffered for their art, didn't they? Lucien would come and go, sometimes vanishing for days. When he returned, he was distant, his poems darker, his body frilier. He spoke of friends who had gone too far, a pianist who couldn't play without the needle, a dancer who had disappeared into the streets, a sculptor who died with his masterpiece unfinished. But no one stopped. Because the city was alive, and no one wanted to fall behind. Paris in those years was a fever dream. The war had taken so much that people were desperate to feel again, to laugh, to love, to forget. Doctors prescribed heroin for sleeplessness, for sadness, for the ghosts of the trenches. Pharmacies sold it freely. Even the newspapers called it a miracle of modern medicine. No one saw the trap until it was too late. Élodie tried to paint without it once. The brush felt heavy, the colors dull. The world seemed empty, like all its beauty had been drained away. She told herself it was only this once, that she would stop after the next painting. But the muse, once awakened, does not let go so easily. Her life became a rhythm of highs and silences. Days blurred. Nights bled into mornings. The city outside went on, bright and careless, while inside her room, time seemed to stop. And yet, amid the decay, her art grew more powerful. Her paintings began to shift, from the brightness of dreams to the shadows of the soul. People saw pain in them, truth in them. Critics called her the voice of a generation lost between beauty and despair. She should have been proud. Instead, she felt hollow. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Lucien appeared again. He looked worse than she'd ever seen him, pale, trembling, his eyes like burnt-out stars. "They're saying it's dangerous," he whispered. "The doctors. They're saying it kills." She laughed softly. "Everything kills, Lucien. Even love." He reached for her hand. His fingers were cold. "Promise me," he said, "if I go, you'll stop." But promises, in that world, were like smoke. Beautiful, but gone too soon. That night, she dreamt of a garden, endless and white. She saw Lucien standing among the flowers, smiling. When she woke, he was gone. 3 days later, they found him in a room by the Seine. A candle still burned beside him. His notebook lay open, a single line written in his final, shaky hand. "We reached for heaven and found the abyss." Élodie didn't cry. She couldn't. She sat by the river and watched the city lights shimmer on the water. For a long time, she thought of jumping in. But something, maybe the faint memory of his voice, stopped her. Instead, she went home and began to paint. She painted through the night, through her tears, through the silence. She painted until her fingers bled. When morning came, she had finished her masterpiece, La Chute d'Anges, The Fall of Angels. It was not beautiful. It was haunting. A swirl of wings and faces, all falling from light into shadow, their eyes wide not with fear, but with longing. It was as though she had painted her entire generation, every dreamer, every artist, every lost soul who had reached too far. When she showed it at a gallery, people stood silent before it. Some wept. A critic wrote that it was the purest expression of modern suffering. But Élodie did not stay to read the reviews. She sold the painting and disappeared from the city. Years later, when the heroin craze faded and laws began to tighten, when Paris awoke from its long fever, people would whisper about her, the girl who painted angels and vanished. And somewhere, in a small forgotten room, her brushes lay dry, her canvases blank, the light from the window dim and dust-filled. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of her voice, soft, distant, like a sigh carried by the Paris wind. Because this was how it began, not with danger, not with crime, but with a dream. A dream of beauty. Of freedom, of escape. The heroin craze of 1920s Paris was never just about drugs. It was about the endless human hunger, to feel, to create, to forget. And in that hunger, so many fell, like angels, painting their wings with fire, not knowing it would burn them to ash. Right after Lucien's death, showing Paris's deeper descent into addiction, Élodie's internal collapse, and the haunting transformation of a city that once danced on the edge of light. Written again in a cinematic, emotional, calm bedtime tone, the kind that drifts between history and heartbreak. After Lucien's death, the city did not stop. Paris never stopped. The lights still shimmered over the Seine, the jazz still played in the basements of Montparnasse, and the champagne still poured in endless rivers. But for Élodie, the sound of laughter had changed. It no longer sparkled, it echoed. Hollow, distant, as though the city were pretending not to notice its own sickness. She had buried Lucien quietly. No family came. Only a few friends from the cafés stood by the grave, their faces pale, their eyes tired. They spoke in whispers, not about the man he had been, but about who might be next. That was Paris in the mid-1920s, a city dancing on borrowed time. Doctors had begun to whisper warnings about heroin. The newspapers, once dazzled by this modern medicine, now printed words like addiction and death. But the warnings came too late. The artists, the dreamers, the ones who lived too close to the fire, they had already fallen. Élodie returned to her attic room after the funeral. The place felt smaller, colder. Lucien's old scarf still hung over the chair. His laughter still lingered in the dust. She sat before her easel, but the canvas stayed blank. Her hands trembled when she tried to paint. Every brushstroke felt wrong. So she reached for what she knew, the small, delicate packet hidden beneath her mattress. Just one more time, she told herself. Just to stop the ache. Just to feel warm again. The needle kissed her skin. The world slowed. And for a few hours, she was back in the dream, Lucien's voice in her ear, the glow of the city outside, the feeling that everything still mattered. But when morning came, and the sun spilled through the cracked window, she saw her reflection, hollow cheeks, dull eyes, a stranger staring back. She pressed her palms against the mirror and whispered, "Who are you?" The mirror did not answer. Days passed like ghosts. She stopped painting for others. Her commissions disappeared. Her landlord grew impatient. Sometimes she wandered through Montmartre, her coat thin against the wind, her eyes searching for faces she once knew. Many of them were gone. Some had left for America, chasing fame. Others had simply vanished. She began to hear the word whispered in the cafés, La Poudre Blanche. It was no longer a secret. It was everywhere. The heroin craze had spilled beyond the artists and into the veins of the city itself, students, musicians, even housewives. Paris had always loved its vices, but this one was different. It didn't dance, it devoured. Police raids grew common. Pharmacies that once sold the drug freely began to shutter. Prices rose. Quality fell. The pure white powder turned gray, then brown, then poisonous. But still, people came back for more. In the dim corners of Montmartre, Élodie found herself surrounded by ghosts, men and women who once painted and wrote and dreamed, now reduced to trembling hands and quiet despair. She would sit beside them in silence, sharing the same needle, the same breath, the same illusion that tomorrow might be kinder. But tomorrow never was. One evening, as she sat beneath the flickering lamplight of Rue Lepic, she met Madeleine, a dancer from the Moulin Rouge. Madeleine was older, her face painted but kind, her laughter sharp enough to cut through sorrow. She saw something in Élodie, the hunger, the ache, and took her hand. "You remind me of myself," Madeleine said. "Before I learned that art and pain are not the same thing." The two women became unlikely friends. They shared stories, cigarettes, the occasional loaf of bread. Madeleine tried to keep Élodie away from the powder, but addiction is a clever thief, it always finds its way in. "I can stop whenever I want," Élodie would say, smiling faintly. Madeleine would sigh. So could I 10 years ago. As months turned into years, Paris began to change again. The jazz age was peaking. American musicians filled the bars with new rhythms, and the city became the heartbeat of the world once more. But behind the glamour, the underbelly grew darker, a quiet epidemic no one wanted to see. By 1925, the government had declared heroin illegal. Doctors who once prescribed it now denied ever touching it. The artists who had sung its praises now whispered of its ruin. But for those already caught, the law meant nothing. Élodie's health began to fail. She coughed blood sometimes. Her fingers shook too much to hold a brush steady. Madeleine begged her to go to a clinic. "They can help you," she said. But Élodie only smiled that tired, wistful smile. "They can't cure the soul, Madeleine. Only numb it." Still, there was something inside her, a small, stubborn flame, that refused to die. One night, she opened her old trunk and found one of Lucien's notebooks. Between its fragile pages, she found a poem she had never read before. The ink was smudged, the handwriting weak, but the words were clear. "We thought art was the cure for pain. But perhaps it was only its mirror." She read it again and again. And something inside her broke, quietly, like ice beneath thawing water. For the first time in years, she wanted to paint, not to escape, but to remember. She sold what little she had left, her coat, a few sketches, even the last of her needles, and bought paint and canvas. The withdrawal came like a storm. Her body shook, her mind burned, her nights became endless rivers of sweat and tears. Madeleine stayed by her side, holding her hand through every wave. "It's all right," she whispered. "Let it pass. You're stronger than you think." And slowly, painfully, the world began to return. Colors seemed strange again, too bright, too real. The sound of footsteps on the street made her heart race. But she painted through it all. Her new work was different. Gone were the grand visions and angelic faces. These were quiet, raw portraits, of empty rooms, lonely windows, rain on cobblestones. They were not beautiful in the way her old paintings had been. But they were honest. When she showed them at a small cafe gallery, the owner frowned. "They're too sad," he said. Élodie smiled. So is life. Yet something about them resonated. People lingered before her canvases, lost in thought. Some cried. Others left small notes behind. "Thank you, I understand, this is me." For the first time, Élodie felt seen, not as a muse, not as a tragedy, but as a person. But healing is not a straight road. Some nights, she still heard Lucien's voice. Some mornings, she still longed for the soft, deadly warmth that had once wrapped around her like a lover. Addiction never truly leaves, it waits, silent, patient, in the corners of the soul. In those moments, she would walk to the Seine and stand on the bridge, watching the water flow beneath her. The city lights shimmered on its surface like broken stars. She would whisper his name, not with sorrow anymore, but with gratitude. "You taught me how to fall," she would say, "and how to rise again." Meanwhile, Paris was changing once more. The artists who survived began to speak out, about the dangers, the deaths, the illusions that had stolen their brightest years. The newspapers now called heroin the white curse. Clinics opened for those who could afford them. And slowly, the fever began to fade. But the scars it left, on people, on art, on the city itself, remained. In a small cafe near Pigalle, Élodie overheard two young painters talking. They spoke of a new kind of art, abstract, bold, unbound by pain. They laughed, full of energy, untouched by the ghosts of the past. For a moment, she felt old. Not in years, but in memory. She smiled softly to herself. Perhaps, she thought, it's their turn to dream. That night, she wrote a letter to Madeleine. "We once believed pain was the source of creation. But I've learned that truth is enough. The world is already full of beauty, we don't have to suffer to find it." She left the letter on the table and walked to the Louvre. Inside, she stood before one of her own early paintings, one of the few that had survived, hung without her name. The colors were brighter than she remembered, the brushstrokes wild and youthful. She almost didn't recognize the woman who had painted it. As she stood there, a young art student nearby whispered to his friend, "They say she died young, overdose, probably." Élodie smiled faintly and turned away. Let them believe it, she thought. Some stories are kinder that way. Outside, the night air was cool. The city glowed softly, no longer fevered but calm, reflective, like an old soul remembering both its sins and its beauty. She walked along the Seine until dawn, her shadow stretching beside her, long and quiet. And when the first light touched the rooftops, she felt it, the gentle warmth of something she had thought lost forever. Peace. Years passed, and Paris changed its face again. The wild glow of the 1920s began to fade like an old photograph, its golden edges curling into sepia. The laughter that once poured from Montmartre's bars grew softer, the jazz quieter, the nights less fevered. The world had danced too fast, too bright, and the dawn had come, slow, unkind, but necessary. Élodie Marchand was now a woman in her 30s. Her hair had lost its fire, her eyes had seen too much, but her hands, the hands that once trembled with addiction, were steady again. She lived quietly in the outskirts of Paris, near the river, in a small apartment where the light fell gently through the curtains each morning. She no longer painted to sell, or to prove, or to forget. She painted because the silence asked her to. Her walls were lined with her own work, not masterpieces, not fame-chasing canvases, but small, honest pieces. Still lives of wilted flowers. Old chairs. Windows half open to the rain. Each one a fragment of memory, a quiet confession. She rarely spoke of the past. But sometimes, at night, she would light a candle and look through Lucien's notebooks, pages yellowed by time, his words fading but never forgotten. The heroin craze had burned itself out. By the early 1930s, new laws had strangled the trade, and the pharmacies that once sold the miracle powder now stocked safer medicines. The addicts were left behind, some in clinics, some in graves, some like Élodie, quietly trying to rebuild the pieces of themselves that had survived. The newspapers stopped writing about it. The artists stopped mentioning it. It became another ghost story, something whispered about in cafés by people too young to remember. Paris wanted to forget. But forgetting, as Élodie knew too well, is just another kind of addiction. She often visited a small art school near Montparnasse, not to teach formally, but to watch. The young painters there reminded her of who she once was, restless, hungry, burning with that unshakable belief that art could change the world. One evening, a student approached her, a boy with paint under his nails and eyes full of questions. "Madam," he asked softly, "is it true you knew Lucien Artois? The poet?" She hesitated. "Why do you ask?" He showed her a small book, the collected poems of Lucien Artois, published posthumously. "His words saved me," the boy said. "I read them when I feel lost." Élodie smiled, a small, sad smile. Then perhaps he didn't die in vain. She never told him how Lucien had died. The boy didn't need that image. He only needed the light that remained. And that, she realized, was what art truly was, not the pain that birthed it, but the light that survived it. Still, every once in a while, the city would whisper reminders. She would see an old friend on the street, thinner, quieter, older. Or she would pass by the same bar where she had first met Lucien, its name now changed, its walls painted over, the music different but the ghosts the same. One winter night, she went back to Montmartre. The air was sharp, the streets slick with frost. She climbed the hill, her breath misting in the air, until she reached the old Café Le Serpent d'Or. It was still there, though smaller now, half forgotten among newer, brighter places. The old piano sat silent in the corner, its keys yellowed. She ordered coffee and sat near the window. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, slow, like ash descending from a quiet heaven. In that moment, she saw them again, not with her eyes, but somewhere deeper. Lucien, laughing, quoting poetry. Madeline, spinning under the stage lights. the artists, the dreamers, the broken and the brave. All the faces of that lost generation, glowing faintly in the half-light of memory. For years, people had called them the fallen. But Élodie knew better. They were not fallen, they had simply reached too far, loved too deeply, and paid too dearly. As the café emptied, she took out her sketchbook and began to draw. Not faces this time, not memories, just the light falling on the glass, the quiet hum of the city below, the echo of life still moving forward. Each line was a breath, a heartbeat, a small act of grace. When she finished, she wrote one line at the bottom of the page. "We painted with pain, but we left behind beauty." She folded the page and placed it beneath her cup, a small gift for whoever might find it next. In the years that followed, Élodie lived in peace. She never became famous. Her name never appeared in the great histories of Parisian art. But her influence lingered, in the quiet tones of new painters who learned to express sorrow without surrendering to it, in the gentle honesty that began to return to French art after decades of chaos. By the 1940s, she had moved to a small village near the Loire. There, she painted the river, the fields, the morning fog. Her style had changed, simpler, humbler, yet filled with a strange serenity. When she died, in her sleep, she was buried beside the river. No newspapers announced it. But among her few possessions was one final canvas, a painting of an angel, wings folded, eyes closed, no longer falling. On the back of the painting, written in her faded handwriting, were the words: "To those who chase beauty in the dark, remember that even the shadows belong to the light." And so, the story of Élodie Marchand became part of a greater, quieter history, the one written not in textbooks, but in hearts. The heroin craze of 1920s Paris faded into memory, but its lesson remained. It had begun as a search for freedom, from pain, from the past, from the unbearable weight of being human. But freedom without balance is a fragile thing. It shatters as easily as glass. That era, often remembered for its art, its jazz, its romance, was also one of quiet despair, a generation trying to feel alive again after the Great War had stolen so much life away. Heroin was never the disease, it was the symptom, the mirror reflecting a wounded world. Historians would later call it l'âge de la poudre, the age of the powder. Between 1920 and 1928, heroin use in France tripled. Artists, veterans, housewives, it spared no one. The government, slow to react, finally banned its sale in 1925. But by then, thousands had already fallen into its silent grasp. And yet, from that darkness, something remarkable grew, a new honesty in art, a willingness to face the broken parts of the human soul. Writers began to speak of trauma, of addiction, of truth. Pain was no longer romanticized, it was understood. Pain became human again. Today, when you walk through Paris and pass the art galleries of Montmartre, you might see paintings from that lost generation, vivid, strange, beautiful, and sad. You might stand before one canvas in particular, La Chute d'Anges, The Fall of Angels, its colors faded but its soul still alive. No one knows who painted it. The plaque simply reads, "Unknown, circa 1923. Visitors stop and stare. Some say they feel something when they look at it, a strange warmth, a melancholy peace. As if the painting itself remembers. And perhaps, in some quiet way, Élodie's spirit lingers there, not in sorrow, but in forgiveness. Watching, waiting, whispering to those who still chase beauty through the dark. Because history, for all its grandeur, is made not of wars and kings, but of small, human stories, of people like Élodie and Lucien, who loved too deeply, fell too hard, and left behind something that time could never quite erase. The heroin craze of 1920s Paris is long gone. The city has healed. The cafés are full again. The music has changed, the faces are new. But the echoes remain, in the brushstrokes, the poems, the quiet ache of creation. And maybe that's what makes Paris eternal. Not its perfection, but its ability to rise from its own ruins, again and again, more fragile, more human, more alive. So, when you lie down tonight and close your eyes, picture that world again. The flicker of candlelight on cracked walls, the soft hum of jazz, the ghosts of dreamers painting through the night. They are still there, somewhere between the stars and the river, still reaching for heaven, still finding beauty in the broken. And as the city sleeps, it dreams with them. Quietly. Endlessly. Together.